morning, and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is fairness. We get to dig into what does that mean? What does it look like? How do we assess it, etc. So before we get started, let's just take a minute or two to get settled in and present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it, and imagine clean, crisp oxygen just flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing every cell, every organ with vital life energy. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, any stress, any negativity, fatigue. And now let's just take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant bright light lighting you up from the inside out, electrifying, illuminating, energizing all your electrons, all your molecules, all your cells, lighting them up from the inside out. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, fatigue, stress, negativity. And now let's just gently press our palms together. Really softly rub your fingers against your palms and feel how delicious that is. Like allow yourself to just sink into the sensual sensation and how lovely it is to be able to focus your attention right on your fingertips and feel how amazing that is when we actually pay attention and allow yourselves to become present right here, right now. So welcome, welcome. It's Friday yet again. Hello, Tammy. Good morning. Maggie's here eating an apple, so that's why she's not in view at the moment, but I'm sure she'll make an appearance. And today's topic is fairness. So I think this came up recently for me in that I'm sorry, hold on. She dropped her apple. Um, Here's Maggie to say hello this morning. Say hi, Maggie. Say hi. Say hello. Say hello. She doesn't know how to say hello yet. There she goes. That's her approximation. Anyway, um, so it came up in a conversation with a friend. We didn't really get to dig too deeply into it yet, but um, I have established a group that is sort of a collective research group, and it's invitation only. It's a small, because we want to keep it a small group, and I'm interested in having it be a group of people who are active in researching this particular area. And so the question is, we're going to be having a running chat, and the question was whether it was fair for people who were not actively engaged in the group to be benefiting directly from everybody's efforts, from the research that is being done in the group. And I think that this is a really, really interesting question. So if I am doing kind of proprietary research, or if you are doing proprietary research as an example, then with a team of people, is it fair for others that have not participated in that research directly, if it's very contained and specific, is it fair, here's the word, to for other people to expect to be able to benefit from that? And I think that I think it's a worthy conversation. Good morning, Irma. Welcome. Great to have you here. So let's say, well, if we look at trademarks, pharmaceutical companies, etc. And I'm not a super fan of pharmaceutical companies, so maybe we should be looking at tech companies instead. but let's say we're looking at a tech company who has a technology that they're developing, and they have a think tank, and they commit all kinds of time and energy to developing this proprietary format. Should they have rights to that technology? Should they should and on the other side, should I have rights to their technology? So it's an interesting conversation, actually, because there are more and more companies that are going. Good morning, Suzanne. Welcome. Good to have you here. There are more and more companies that are going open source. Good morning, Robert. Great to have you here. So we're talking about fairness. And the example that we're looking at is companies, for instance, that are doing proprietary research. They're spending time and energy and resources, money or other resources to develop this research. What is it unfair not to share that secret sauce type technology with other people or other companies or whatever? And it's an interesting question, as I was saying, because there are more and more technology companies and business, social business enterprises that are sharing their technology freely, making their technology open source rather than keeping all of their intelligence locked locked into um, proprietary agreements, which is it's really interesting. So for instance, if I'm interested in a company, and let's say somebody's interested in investing in a company, you often end up having to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that you don't share their proprietary information, right? So how do we approach this whole idea of what's fair and what's not? Because um, this is the conversation. There are two different examples, obviously, but what is fairness? So I looked it up because I'm a nerd, and the definition for fairness wasn't particularly illuminating, but it had to do with the quality of being just. So I looked up just and justice, and it has to do with moral rightness and rightfulness or lawfulness, moral principle dictating conduct. So, there's so many ideas that we have about things. Like, we can say, well, that's not fair, but how many of us have actually stepped back and defined what is fairness? And I as I was thinking about that this morning, I was kind of in a quandary, as to what fairness actually is. And I know when I have a sense of fairness or unfairness, but I can't say that I have a conscious working definition of it. And what I recognize is that as I was thinking about what fairness meant to me, it was very much tied to my values. And so if someone values um, sovereignty or privacy, you might have a different notion, at least when it comes to information, um, of what fairness means. And if we're playing, yeah, on the schoolyard, for instance, and in terms of conduct in the games that we play, we probably have a similar sense of fairness. However, it's still based on underlying values. Good morning, Rosalind. So how do we approach what's there and what's not when talking about fairness? You take it at face value or not. So I think where I'm going with it is, if we are setting up systems, because one of the big things that we've been exposed to this past year is the unfairness of our systems when it comes to racial equality or inequality, right? That there is a lack of fairness, really, in the way that our systems are implemented, in the way our social justice or our justice system plays out, et cetera. That there have been issues around fairness and social equality and racial equality, et cetera. And so I tend to think that in some realm, that, as I was saying, if we're going to be creating systems, and then we're creating a guideline or guidelines for those systems. For instance, here's another scenario potentially. Let's say we were establishing an intentional community, and we talk about maybe what we want to be including in the principles of this community is that things are guided by a sense of fairness, that when there are disputes, they are brought before a group of peers or whatever, and that the principles of fairness apply. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? It's so abstract. There's so many. It's interesting to me because the more we dig into the meaning of different words here, the more I recognize how abstract so much of our language is, and we take for granted that we have a common understanding until we don't. And rather than taking the time to really dive into definitions of these words that we use. So this has also come really clear for me in working with my clients. I have this deck of values cards. Let me show you, that I made, that I had put together, and I use them with my clients. They're also available for sale. They're really cool. They're called Core Connection cards, and there are 125 values in this little pouch. So for instance, this is the one I just picked, compassion. This is what they look like on the back. They're awesome to hold and work with. Really awesome tool. You can find them on my website. Here's a shameless plug. You can find them at yourcoreconnection.com. And there is a tab when you get to the website that says cards, I believe. So you can check that out there. And there's some videos of people talking about how they've used them and such. But in using them, the way that I use them with folks is to identify core values. And there are multiple ways to use them, but in identifying the core values, you go through the cards and you eliminate words that don't resonate for you. But then the ones that resonate, you know, ultimately we ask ourselves the question, what can I not live without? So for me, I can't live without creativity and beauty and consciousness and wonder. So, you know, like these are some, and freedom. These are my core values. And because they are what makes my heart beat. So the thing is that in going through these cards, people have very different definitions of what these different words mean. And I have used them, I use them with a startup company to, as in a consulting arrangement. And there were a lot, let's see, there were 3 people, and in many cases they had chosen the same words, similar words, but it was really important for us to define what they meant by the words, because people have different understandings of different words. And commonly we don't, when I say yes, we have to have a sense of fairness, you and I might agree about that and say yes, indeed, we need to have a sense of fairness, but we don't know exactly what that means. What does that look like? Does that look like in a meeting everybody gets equal time? In a meeting, does it mean that the that we take turns going first? Or does, what does it look like in our workings in a meeting? Does it mean that one person gets to hold the floor and other people need to let them have their their time to speak regardless of how long it takes? What is fairness? How does it show up in the world? How does it show up in your world? I know for me, I do have a very strong internal sense about justice, meaning, and fairness, like really wanting to be fair in my dealings. And for me, this is really an inquiry, because I don't have an answer. I'm engaged with you right now to be looking at, well, what actually does it mean? Like, what's at the heart of fairness? And as I'm thinking about it, I think part of the equation for me in the definition of fairness is respect. So giving respect to, for me, and this is personal, it may or may not be the case for you, but for me, part of fairness is being respectful of other people's opinions and input, and dealing respectfully with people, even if it's not even if at that moment their input may be irrelevant. That doesn't mean that I have to respect their right to give their input in that moment, because I can say, no, this isn't an appropriate time for you to be interjecting, and that I don't think that that's necessarily unfair. Um, Irma says, to me, the heart of fairness is the absolute respect of our human dignity. Exactly. So respectfully declining to allow participation or so Irma says, looking for the good of all. So I have a problem with the good of all. I mean, I look for that. I have to say I do, like, to be working to consider um, the impact of an action on others. And what here, okay, so here, this is a really provocative conversation I'm going to invite us into for in a second. But let me see. Rosalind says, what value am I willing to pay for food that is raised using fair practices? So being fair can be seen as applying value to a product, which is arbitrary and different to each person. So what's a fair price? That's an interesting use of the word. Okay, so here, let's look at this. And I don't have an answer for it, frankly. So if in this, and this is a mind experiment, and like I said, provocative, we're in the age of COVID, right? So this whole vaccine thing is rolling out, and in the sense of fairness, is it fair to mandate vaccine when you think of the good of the whole? So um, there are very differing beliefs about what will support the good of the whole when it comes to COVID right now, and the vaccine and masks and all of that. So is it, if we're talking about the good of the whole, is it okay to sacrifice the good of the few for the good of the many? Is that fair? It's really, really interesting. On an abstract level, we can probably answer that more easily than if we were to go on a case by case basis, correct? So let's say somebody has, let's say they um, imagine that there is this COVID passport that people are talking about, and that means that if you don't have a a vaccination, that potentially your travel could be restricted, and who knows what else could be restricted if you don't get a vaccination. Well, maybe that might seem fair, because it would potentially, in an idealized way, if all of it is true, and the dangers are what the dangers are, and the vaccine mitigates the danger, et cetera. If all these assumptions are true, then what happens if you're a person who has had really adverse reaction to vaccines, and it could be lethal to you? Is it fair to make you take that vaccine, and is it fair to restrict your travel based on the fact that you haven't had the vaccine? I mean, it's really, really interesting moral questions when we dig into this notion of fairness, like what is really fair? And then, as a kid, how many of us used to cry, it's not fair, it's not fair, and the parents would say, who said anything about being fair? The world's not fair. you know but even as kids, we had this notion of fairness somehow. And Robert says, well, the good of all, sometimes the good of one can be the bad for another. Exactly. In fact, we see that all the time right now, where the good of corporations in many instances, especially related to environmental issues, is definitely for the bad of more than the corporation, is for the bad of all in some respect, right? So the good of one, the corporation, can be for the bad of all, and somehow our laws allow that. Is that fair? So Robert says life isn't fair. Well, I tend to agree with you, Robert, and I wonder about this whole notion of fairness, this construct that we've made, um, to say, well, that's not fair. It's not fair that this person is suffering and not having enough food to put on their table, and that this other person has mansions in 17 countries. That's not fair. Well, who said it should be fair? Who said it was fair? And so I think, again, these are mind experiments, conversations to be looking at the way that we interact with our lives and each other, So if we believe that life isn't fair, how is it that we have this doctrine of fairness, or that we try to guide our behavior based on what's fair? What does it mean? What does it mean? So Robert says, yes, I agree. The laws are made only for the masses, apparently not for the few. Well, the laws are made for the masses in some cases, and in some cases the laws are made for the few, meaning the corporations. There are many laws that favor corporate interests over individual interests. So yeah, we get to look at, is fairness an important thing in our individual lives? I notice that I do tend to want to be fair and play fair. And, what we hear about playing fair or playing dirty. If you don't play fair, you're playing dirty or you're cheating, right? So, what does it mean to play fair? Or we'll say that person doesn't play fair. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean that they don't play fair? They're not meeting a certain um, social expectation, maybe. Good morning, Abdullah Fatah. Welcome. We're talking about fairness and what does it actually mean, and it seems like it's something that we collectively understand until one of our notions of fairness is challenged, and then we can realize that the whole idea breaks down because we don't have a legit definition that is common, in terms of the way that fairness might translate to behavior. We can agree, and this is actually really interesting. Suzanne says, I try to approach everything with love. You know what? When we approach things with love, maybe the whole conversation about fairness goes away, and that's a richer place to be. Now, the thing is that love's another one of those words. What does it mean to approach everything with love? It might look different for you and for me and for everybody else. Um, if I'm being loving, does that mean that I endure your abuse of me? What does it mean? So here's what I was going to say. Is I was reading a book by Ralph Nader called Unstoppable, and um, he talks about a convergence of the left and the right, and finding some kind of places where we can meet and still get things done in the world. And he said that on principle, there are many things that both sides agree on. That it's the implementation that's where things break down. And I think that happens here too, especially when we're talking about things like fairness, for example. So Irma says, in that respect, practice looking for the common welfare should come first, and the personal progress depends upon unity. Well, it's interesting. If we're looking at the common welfare, then, some people would say that's communism. And actually, in its ideal, in its pure ideal, communism means caring everybody in the collective, caring for the collective willingly, not because it's mandated, right? But how do you implement something like that? How do we instill the care for the collective? Because for me, like I'm doing my best to promote sustainable futures. Why? Because that's important for the collective if we're going to survive on this planet, right? But does that, where are the lines, and is fairness an important and valid metric in the context of making policies that are going to change the course of the future? Dido says, we are hardwired. I'll try again. We are hardwired for reciprocity, which worked well for the 99% of human history when we were hunter-gatherers. Reciprocity, sharing food with all, even though only a few of the band killed the animal, meant everyone took turns to provide food and helped everyone survive. The challenge is that life is very complex now. Yes, it is, Dido, and we can always count on you for awesome input. So there are tribal groups in Africa, for instance, that still, it's their livelihood is the community, that everybody shares everything, and and it's that's the way of being. And in our Western culture, we're very uh, the words that are coming to the mind are independent, but it's not just independent. It's very self-centered, self-focused and individualistic, and rather than communistic or collectively istic. um, so so we get to be looking at this notion of individual versus collective, and where is the line? Are you willing to give up your rights for the benefit of the collective? I personally am not willing to have a vaccine because I am immunocompromised and it could be life threatening to me. And so is it okay to force me to have a vaccine that could kill me? You know, this is what's fair. What's fair? Is it fair for me to not have a vaccine if we know for certain that my having a vaccine would protect the bigger populace? Am I a danger to the bigger collective if I don't have a vaccination? So this is real questions. I don't have an answer. Robert says, yes, sometimes in order to make it fair for everyone, we need to fight fire with fire. So Irma says, based on human equality and dignity. Greedy. Yeah. So, greed is an enemy of fairness. I think I agree with you. So interesting stuff, right? Like good questions to be looking at. Um, I I think that we're in a time where we really, really do get to think deeply about these principles. And when we think about war, the whole thing in war is sacrificing the few for the betterment of the many. Now we might have issue with this whole, is this really for the betterment of the many? And what's fair in terms of being able to challenge that notion, and is fairness relevant even? So, part of me, interestingly, because I'm about having individual rights for sure, and I'm also about the good of the whole. For me, if I were in power, I would mandate that we would curtail the use of any single-use plastics that were not compostable or biodegradable. I would mandate that. When we look at individual freedoms, we all wear seatbelts. There's a law saying we have to wear seatbelts. There are laws that say that we get fined if we text and drive. Why? For the good of the whole. Your text message, my text message, is nowhere near as important as the people that we might kill while we're driving a vehicle and texting. So where do we draw the line where between personal freedoms and collective welfare? You know, what's fair? So I think it's a provocative conversation. And I do believe that we really do need to look deeply at these issues now more than ever, because individual rights versus collective welfare is up for challenge right now. And I think that in our intimate lives, we have more opportunity to engage in fairness. And in the process of doing so, we get to have the conversation about what is fair. So if we lay out the rules from the very beginning, is it fair to enforce those rules? You know, if that's the condition, is it fair to uphold those rules? So for instance, let's say I am at a high security company and the rules are that nothing goes outside of the walls of the company. And then I see egregious criminal activity. Is it fair for me to have to uphold that agreement to secrecy? So Irma says, why should individual rights be against the good of all? I'm not saying that individual rights are against the good of all, but there are times when that's the case. So for instance, the scenario about the vaccine, maybe, you know, or the scenario of let me think of something else, you know, if I'm asserting my right not to be vaccinated because it could be deadly to me, if the populace believes that I could be deadly to the populace, then there's a conflict between individual rights and the good of all, right? And I think we can see lots of scenarios like that. And again, in this, the example that I gave, for instance, in this organization, I mean, look at Robert Snowden, where he was a high security, high clearance guy and charged with having, keeping security, right? But he was a whistleblower. And so, because he saw egregious oversteps. So some people believe that he's a traitor because he betrayed certain governmental secrets. But those secrets were, you know, some of those secrets were that our whole population was being illegally surveilled. So is he, you know, did he serve the good of the whole by, or did he jeopardize the good of the whole by exerting his what he believed to be his obligation as a citizen? You know, it gets murky. I don't, the bottom line is it's not black and white. Is his name Robert? It's not. It's not. What is Snowden's first name? I'm sorry. I want to, Dido, I'm going to count on you to tell us what Snowden's first name is, because I don't want to leave my ignorance there uncorrected. Rosalind says, so if fairness is to be mandated and becomes the responsibility of the government to implement, what issues get enforced? Exactly. What's fair? You know, if we look, I don't think our laws have much to do with fairness in many, many cases, frankly. Maybe there needs to be different options, not just black and white options. Exactly, Irma. There aren't, because it's not a black and white issue. Edward, thank you so much, Dido. I knew it wasn't Robert. Thank you. So correction, me being ignorant there. So, or incorrect. Thank you so much for that correction, Dido. So Dido says Dido here, I like the principle of the fierce sword compassion, which needs courage at times to say yes and sometimes to say no, say to racism or abuse. Yeah. So I think that this conversation, Edward Snowden, thank you, thank you. I think that this conversation is really powerful because when we think of fairness, we think of it kind of as black and white. We think of fairness as this good, compassionate thing, right? And like it's clear cut, but it isn't. It isn't, right? And I think where we get to go in our movement forward into a new paradigm is to live in the gray areas and to recognize that we can't just paint things with so broad a brush, that we get to look more closely at what our operating principles are. And that's what our court systems, well, our court systems are supposed to uphold the law. But the thing is, there are times if we say it's against the law to steal bread, and the consequence for stealing bread, hello, Tony, welcome, welcome. The consequence for stealing bread is that you get 5 years in prison, and then you find somebody who's stealing bread and reselling it. They probably would deserve the 5 years in prison. You find somebody who stole bread once because their child was starving. Do they get 5 years in prison because that's what the law says? What's fair, right? So, Tony, it's been forever, forever. We're talking about fairness. Anyway, this is beyond where we usually go with the conversations in terms of time. So I'm going to say that we'll wrap this up. And I want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us for this conversation. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. I go live each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page. And I invite you to go and check out all the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and get involved in the community. There's so many meditations and teachings and just wonderful information and resources. So I, again, so appreciate this time with you and these really stimulating conversations. So until next time, I wish you a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful weekend. And Maggie just came back in time to say goodbye. Lots and lots of love to you, and hope to see you again real soon.